Now, Labour were quick out of the gates yesterday to suggest this is about backroom deals. Is there a lack of transparency, though, around the process here? You also acknowledged there were conflicts of interest that ministers had and they were being managed, but we don't know what they are.
I think it's getting quite tiresome that people immediately leap towards the conclusion that something vile has happened.
All right, move on. Nothing to see here, please.
People have played by the rules.
Nothing to see here, please.
But are the rules strong enough? I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, a trend that's been rising across multiple governments over the last several years. The increasing numbers of politicians failing to manage real or perceived conflicts of interest. There are growing calls for an independent watchdog to keep them honest, and a new advocacy body's been formed to lobby for an overhaul of political ethical controls.
I'm setting up the Integrity Institute at the moment, which is a new advocacy and think tank.
That's political scientist Bryce Edwards, who's running the new Integrity Institute. And here's why it started.
For years, New Zealand has benefited from a reputation for having low levels of corruption compared to most other countries. But a new report suggests we are at risk of complacency, and significant changes are needed to tighten up rules around lobbying, political donations and official information.
An increase in fraud, corruption in border and immigration services and a lack of transparency in the lobbying industry could be why New Zealand is falling on global corruption rankings. The 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index sees New Zealand dropped to 4th out of 180 countries, continuing a downward trend of the past 3 years.
This is a really weak spot. It's been commented on by the UN, by the EU. Every study that's done of New Zealand comments on the fact we have really lax rules around lobbying.
And who wants this information out in the open? Well, journalists for one, because we're all busybodies, but that's not the main reason.
This is bigger than one political term, whether it be 3 or 4 years. It's bigger than one economic cycle or one, recessionary cycle. It speaks to the trust in our core democratic institutions and, the cohesion of our society, which is something that we are increasingly talking about and that we're increasingly concerned about.
This is Newsroom's political editor Laura Walters, who's written about the need for more scrutiny of politicians' interests. I spoke to her and senior political reporter Mark Dulder about what the problems are, why we're hearing more and more about them, and what needs to be done.
I think that we need to think about this in the broader context of kind of trust in institutions, what we're seeing around the world, not just in New Zealand, around, faith in political institutions, democratic institutions, media as an institution. And there is a lot of trust and faith dropping kind of as a general trend. And at the same time, we're also seeing a public that has more access to information, that are, wanting to critically analyse things. They're wanting answers. They're wanting to see more kind of transparency. So there's kind of a convergence. It would be hard to know whether the instances of these types of things are actually rising or whether there is just more focus on this because of the kind of moment in time that we are in. But there have been quite a few examples recently, and not just under this government, this current coalition government, also under the previous Labour government. But we are seeing kind of more reporting on this, more discussion around this, and more calls for maybe changing the regimes, asking for more transparency, asking for some kind of independent oversight or watchdog, and essentially calling for New Zealand political institutions and also New Zealanders to kind of come out of their complacency and ask for more transparency, for more safeguards around this type of thing to ensure that there is both integrity and also trust in our institutions.
If you look at the track record of media coverage of these issues, you can see that it's equal opportunity, right? The media covered conflict of interest issues under the previous government, under Labour, with Stuart Nash, with Michael Wood, which led to those ministers resigning.
Stuart Nash has fundamentally breached my trust and the trust of his cabinet colleagues. His conduct is inexcusable. This morning I have advised the Governor-General to accept Michael Wood's resignation as a minister. Yesterday I was alerted to additional shareholdings Michael held in the J.M. Ferry Family Trust, of which he is both a trustee and a beneficiary. These new shareholdings raise significant concerns around Michael not identifying and managing potential conflicts of interest.
And now the media is covering conflict of interest issues and perceptions of conflicts of interest within the current government, all three coalition parties. So there's not a one-sided approach being taken here. There's a history of media having checked where there are conflicts of interest, regardless of party, regardless of who is in power. But the issue is whether someone in power is misusing or potentially misusing or being perceived to misuse that power due to a conflict of interest.
Okay, well, what safeguards currently do we have in place?
Yeah, so the main safeguards are focused on ministers rather than MPs, so those who, have the power of the executive. Insofar as they're safeguards, they're very soft ones. They're more convention, I think it would be fair to say, than hard rule. There's the Cabinet Manual, which requires ministers to disclose to their colleagues any conflicts of interest or scenarios where there might be a perceived conflict of interest. And then the Cabinet Office, on a regular basis, now 6 monthly, I believe, reports those conflicts of interest at a very high level of detail and what's being done to manage them, if anything. For example, the most recent register of ministers' interests talks about, for example, Mark Patterson, who's an Associate Minister of Agriculture, the Minister for Rural Communities, has a pecuniary or financial interest in certain parts of the emissions trading scheme. And it says from August 14 onwards last year, he's not going to get any papers that discuss that, and he's not going to be participating in any conversations in Cabinet about those issues. It's not clear whether he only disclosed it on August 14th or whether he had disclosed it earlier, but it hadn't been judged a conflict of interest until then. What we now know is that he did sit in on Cabinet conversations about those ETS settings that he now would not be able to anymore under this new conflict of interest kind of management protocol, while he still did have that financial interest. So this is one of the flaws of the current system, right? You just don't get the level of detailed information that you'd actually want. And yes, you can go and ask the minister, which I have done, but they're under no obligation to disclose it. And while there is an active OIA request seeking this information, past experience has suggested that the OIA isn't an effective tool for disclosing this kind of information. Usually the Cabinet Office and ministers are able to ward it off.
Do we have enough in place? Like, how do we stand up to other countries in terms of keeping things secret?
Other countries or other comparable jurisdictions are doing more than New Zealand. One example that is often brought up is Australia's lobbying register and lobbying rules. We don't have anything of the type in New Zealand, so we don't have an official register of all of the lobbying groups or lobbying interests in New Zealand, or rules that specifically dictate that, like a stand-down period. Say if a minister or a politician leaves politics, is no longer an MP, they can move straight into, a job in, say, government relations or lobbying without a stand-down period. That's not allowed in some other comparable jurisdictions. So that is one.
This is like Chris Farfoy, right? We're talking about.
Exactly.
Well, the revolving door from politics to the business world of lobbying is causing a stir. Less than 3 months after leaving Parliament, the former government minister, Chris Farfoy, is heading up a new PR and lobbying firm called Dialogue 22.
And there have been some others who have worked in kind of chief of staff roles and things, both in Labour and national-led governments that have done a similar thing. And it is absolutely their right to do it. There is nothing illegal. There is nothing wrong with that. But we don't have any rules around that. We don't have a need for disclosure of that, and we don't have any rules prohibiting it. So there is nothing that they have done wrong in New Zealand, but it wouldn't be allowed in other countries. There's this kind of something that's often brought up in New Zealand is the revolving door that happens between people working in politics and then people working in government relations or lobbying. And that absolutely makes sense. The skill set is transferable. I think that the issue that a lot of people are having in New Zealand is that there is not transparency around that. There is not disclosure of that. And there's no specific stand-down period there showing that, because there are sometimes questions whether information that you might have had when you're, working within government or within politics could then be used potentially on the other side or on the outside. So that's something that a lot of other countries have safeguards in place around. Also, in terms of, say, pecuniary interests or financial interests, there is a disclosure register in New Zealand that started in about 2005, and that was hailed as a big leap forward for New Zealand in terms of that transparency. It shows things like ministerial shareholdings, which is, how the whole saga around Labour's Michael Wood came up. But what we don't have is the same level of detail as other countries. So in Australia, you see the level of that shareholding. How many shares does someone have in this? So there's greater level of detail in other countries. And in the UK, there's a full ministerial pecuniary interests register. So in New Zealand, it's for MPs. It's at a relatively high level. It doesn't drill down as far. But in the UK, we see one specifically for ministers that goes into great detail there. And I would say as well that a lot of this information could well be held by the Cabinet Office. They might understand more about those conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest. They might understand more about the shareholdings. But what is put out to the public, what is on the official public record, is quite bare bones. And I think that that's something that a lot of the public and special interest groups that are calling for more transparency, that's where the issue lies. They want to see more information available to the public. It's not suggesting that there's something untoward or underhand happening here. It's just that any information held, within reason, without disclosing, personal family interests at a granular level of detail, but that the public should have more information so they can have greater trust in the integrity and the political ethics of those who are making these, really important decisions on behalf of the country.
It could taint New Zealand's reputation. That's Transparency International's take on fast-track legislation that will give just 3 ministers the power to greenlight significant infrastructure and development projects. The Transport, Regional Development and Infrastructure ministers would have final say on consenting things like mines or dams, regardless of an expert panel's advice, and even if a court has previously denied consent.
The fast-track one is an interesting one, right? Because that shows an example of where actually the government can step in and provide a little bit more information about how they manage conflicts of interest. The various ministers involved in making those decisions declared their conflicts of interest. There's been documents that have been released that have shown, what they said and how those companies were then handed off to different ministers to be making decisions for. But, it is one of the weaknesses of the framework pointed out by many of the submitters on the fast track, including individuals like the Auditor General, like the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, a range of, statutorily independent and authoritative kind of perspectives saying, hey, one of the issues with the level of ministerial involvement in the fast track system, which has been watered down a bit, but not fully, is that it creates room for this, again, perception of a conflict. Even if there isn't a conflict there, even if it is really well managed, even the perception alone can be really damaging to New Zealand's reputation, to people's faith and trust in political institutions, in the process that has led to these companies being listed and these projects being listed in the fast track bill. And so it's not to say everything's fine, nor is it to say everything's really corrupt and there is definitely bribery happening. The truth is generally somewhere in the middle, right? Of more needs to be done to disclose this, and ministers should be thinking very carefully when they're setting up systems that are potentially prone to abuse, even if they themselves have no intention of abusing them.
Why are politicians not required to have their shareholdings in a blind trust, that they don't know which shareholdings they have?
Some countries do that, and there, as I understand it, there was work started by Labour under Chris Hipkins' premiership to look at something like that, because other countries do a similar thing to that, so that the ministers or the MPs wouldn't have control over how they move around those shareholdings.
New Zealand is a small country, right? We would expect there to be potential conflicts between people based on personal, based on financial interests, based on a wide range of interests. You've got, Māori MPs who have stakes in Māori land, who are making decisions about Māori land-related policy. That's always going to be hard to disentangle. Mark Patterson, he's a farmer. He should be perfectly entitled to plant trees on his farm if he'd like, and to earn some ETS credits. The difficulty is, given that you've got a situation where conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest are likely to crop up, that only heightens the need for there to be transparency about what those are, so that Mark Patterson can come out and say, when he's made a minister, we get the information that says, hey, he's got this interest and here's what we're doing about it. Not a year and a half down the road saying there is an interest and we won't tell you what it is, and we did start to do something about it at one stage, but we won't tell you why it took so long, or what specifically is being done. And so that's where the issue comes up. Not just that people have conflicts of interest or may have conflicts of interest. That's always going to be the case. It's going to be really hard to find people that have no, personal or financial interests in New Zealand society, because they're Kiwis, right? It makes sense. But it's about what you do given that situation. You can't just shrug and say, too hard. You have to do something. And transparency is at least the basic first step of, if everyone has that information, then people can make judgments for themselves about whether things are being done appropriately or inappropriately.
So Labor started some kind of process to try and tighten things up. But what's happened to that? What's going on at the moment?
Labor is obviously not in government at the moment, but Chris Hipkins has said that he is continuing to work on that policy, and he will release a specific policy around, in this space before the election. In terms of what the government itself is doing, when this coalition government and Christopher Luxon came into power, they changed the need for disclosure around conflicts of interest from an annual disclosure to the public to a twice yearly disclosure to the public. Of course, there are other things, constant check-ins with ministers and, needs for constant disclosures as things change in the background. That's happening to the Cabinet Office. What the public see is, twice a year, an updated conflicts of interest register. So that is a change under this government. That's happening more frequently. Other than that, a broader piece of work, we haven't gotten any sense that anything is changing in that space, or that there is a government policy around that at this stage. The Cabinet Office, when I spoke to them, said that they were comfortable with the type of work that they were doing in this space. Those twice yearly disclosures around conflicts of interest. They deal with one specific person in each minister's office to ensure that there's kind of a level of knowledge from that office and a level of consistency around these disclosures. They always prompt ministers when they come in with a template. They try and get them to disclose as much as they can, to be really forthcoming with anything, and then it's up to the Cabinet Office to decide whether there is a potential issue there. So, there's kind of discussions happening behind the scenes, but in terms of a broader change in policy or any kind of overhaul, that's not something that anyone in the government has signalled at this stage.
I love that phrase, they're comfortable with it, Laura, because that seems to be the Prime Minister's attitude whenever a suggestion pops up that somebody might be unduly influenced by something. That, no worries, it's fine, it's being handled, don't worry about it, she'll be right. And then you try and speak to that MP who's at the centre of it and they won't answer questions. And these two sort of work hand in hand to make you think, well, maybe there is something there actually.
Yeah, it's frustrating, right? But that's the problem with this lack of transparency is you have to take people's word for it. And yes, the people in the Cabinet Office are professionals, but it's ultimately the Prime Minister's call in terms of how these things are dealt with, what's declared, what's managed, and so on. And he can be comfortable with it, but that doesn't necessarily mean the public is comfortable with it, that the sector or other stakeholders are comfortable with it, or that the opposition or all the various kinds of levers and layers of accountability that exist are comfortable with it. It's just not a very satisfying answer, right? It just says basically, trust me, I've got it handled. You don't need any more details or information. It's just asking us to give him blind trust. And look, maybe behind the scenes everything is all tidy, all kosher, but we just don't know unless we're told.
Now, yesterday we heard from Chris Bishop. He said that whilst there had been a donation, I think it was Winton Property, to the National Party, that wasn't a conflict of interest.
People can go and search themselves as to what donations may have been made, either to myself or to the party. And that's all I'll say about that matter.
The Associate Health Minister, Casey Costello, has denied any dealings with the tobacco industry while facing questions on her credibility from health professionals.
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem like everything's all kosher, does it? Because I was just looking at just a few things that have cropped up over the last, this government's term and the last one, that have been concerning issues of political transparency. And we've had randoms having swipe card access to Parliament, and lobbyists, MPs who become lobbyists as soon as they leave, as we've been talking about, blabbing about what happens in Cabinet, that's Stuart Nash, failing to declare conflicts of interest, suspect donations, suspect fundraising activities, donor identities hidden through trusts or foundations, MPs making decisions that seem to be based on the handbook for the lobbyists that are, hanging around Parliament. It all adds up to a feeling that something isn't on the level.
And I think that's why there are growing calls for independent oversight. There has been a feeling in New Zealand for a really long time that we do live in a high trust society in New Zealand, that we are, we're open, we're transparent, we have integrity, we're low in corruption, we always do well in those indices that come out every year, and we kind of pat ourselves on the back and move on and think, well, there's nothing to see here, obviously, we're fine. But there are many examples now that are raising question marks around whether there has just been complacency and whether actually we're not so, that the level of integrity and the level of corruption is not perhaps what we thought it has been, and that the systems in place are not good enough to weed out these examples and to try and manage these conflicts in a better way, put in place a more robust regime to ensure they don't happen in the first place. And so you'll see, varying special interest in lobby groups now calling for independent oversight of this regime, a kind of independent watchdog of some sort. We also see former ministers, including, we've got Helen Clark, Chris Finlayson and Holly, who have all been speaking to this recently.
New Zealand has relied for a long time on the social norms and ethical norms of politicians in New Zealand society to protect us against corruption. And, for a long time, those seem to more or less work. So what is changing now that leads us to think we can't just rely on that anymore? Do we need more legislative change and regulations to better protect us from the risks of political corruption?
I think the short answer is yes. Our standards are still very high, but we're slipping. And when it comes to corruption, then I think we need to take a zero tolerance approach.
Our reputation really is critical for us. So that's why we're saying, look, it's time we stop taking this for granted. We're too complacent and we need to take some action.
We've seen the likes of Health Coalition Aotearoa, the newly formed lobby group, the Integrity Institute. They're all saying we need to do something differently in this space because, like you say, these examples all start to add up and paint a picture of New Zealand and of our political institutions that are perhaps not the picture that most New Zealanders would have thought initially, or a situation that we can't reconcile with our view of ourselves as low corruption and high integrity country when it comes to political institutions.
Yeah, but I mean, up till now, this discussion has been one of ethics and morals and should we and how far do we go. But Transparency International has now come out and said this is affecting our corruption perception index, and that affects trade and international trust. So we're getting now to a situation, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, where people are looking twice at New Zealand. We no longer have that reputation of being totally above board, that we've relied on that trope for too long.
It's a wake-up call, isn't it? I think you're bang on with this, and I think that it's these types of things. I mean, it should be enough for domestically those questions to lead to some kind of change. But if we're seeing other countries and international, indices point to New Zealand as a place that is less trustworthy than it previously was, then I think that's a pretty good argument to look at some kind of policy change around this, or at least make these systems more robust.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Laura Walters and Mark Dilder from Newsroom's political team. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.